The blue light of my monitor is the only thing illuminating my office at 3 a.m., reflecting off a face that looks 10 years older than 35. I just finished reconciling the quarterly tax filings for Vance Logistics, a mess my brother Brian created by forgetting to log 3 weeks of interstate freight invoices. My father, Harold, will wake up in a few hours, see the polished reports on his desk, and praise Brian for his strategic oversight. Meanwhile, I'll be the one drinking lukewarm coffee, invisible in the machinery I spent 15 years building from the grease up. For over a decade, I have been the heartbeat of this company. Yet in every framed family portrait hanging in our Naperville estate, I am the one pushed just slightly out of the frame. My name is Rachel Vance. I am the chief operating officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics firm in Chicago. But if you looked at my W-2 or the title on my door, you'd think I was a glorified executive assistant. The paradox of my life is simple and suffocating. The more I succeed, the more I am diminished. My father has a philosophy that feels like it was ripped from a 19th century manifesto. He believes my intelligence is a biological tool meant to sharpen the edges of the men in the family. "You have a head for the ledgers, Rachel," he would say, his voice thick with the arrogance of a man who hasn't checked his own bank balance in years. "It's your duty to shore up the foundation so your brother can lead the charge. It's what a Vance woman does." My mother, Adelaide, is the velvet glove to my father's iron fist. She doesn't scream, she sighs. She doesn't demand, she guilt trips. When I graduated from the University of Chicago with an MBA, achieved while working 40-hour weeks managing our warehouse shifts in the soot and noise, she didn't celebrate. She leaned in and whispered, "Don't let those fancy degrees make you forget where you belong, honey. You don't need to stand at the head of the table to have a seat at it. Your brother needs your strength, not your competition." The contrast between Brian and me isn't just a gap, it's a canyon. Brian is 38, a man-child who treats the corporate credit card like a personal lottery win. Last year, for his birthday, my father gifted him a custom Porsche 911, citing his visionary potential. I, the woman who negotiated the Series B funding that kept us afloat during the 2022 supply chain crisis, I am still driving a 2012 SUV that groans every time I merge onto the I-55. When I asked for a salary adjustment to match industry standards for a COO, my father laughed. "We're reinvesting in the company's future, Rachel. You know the margins are tight. Besides, your father provides for you. Why do you need more?" Reinvesting in the future was code for funding Brian's failed real estate ventures. But they made a fatal mistake. They assumed that because I was silent, I was submissive. They mistook my loyalty for a lack of options. In reality, I was becoming the invisible architect. Over the last 10 years, I didn't just manage the company. I wove myself into its very source code. I designed the proprietary ERP system we use to track thousands of shipments across the Midwest. I am the sole administrator for our encrypted bank tokens and the only person with the secondary authorization keys for our high-value insurance bonds. I spent my nights building a shadow ledger, a meticulous, legally sound record of every creative accounting move Harold made and every consulting fee Brian siphoned off to his shell companies. I knew the culture of our family. I was the workhorse, Brian was the show pony. They thought I would carry them forever because family comes first. But they forgot that a pillar only holds up the roof as long as the foundation is respected. If the weight becomes too great and the cracks are ignored, the pillar doesn't just break. It lets the whole ceiling come down. I've been waiting. Not for a miracle, but for the inevitable moment when Brian's incompetence would exceed my ability to hide it. Early this morning, on a cold Tuesday in January 2026, that moment arrived. My desk phone buzzed. It was Marcus, our CFO, and the only man in the building who knows exactly how much I do. His voice was strained, the kind of tone a man uses when he's looking at a shipwreck. "Rachel, you need to look at the escrow account for the O'Hare expansion project. Now." I pulled up the interface, my fingers flying across the keys. My heart didn't race. It went cold. There was a 7-figure hole where our liquidity was supposed to be. A series of unauthorized wire transfers had been initiated over the last 48 hours, routed through a private equity firm I recognized as one of Brian's hobbies. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty that could trigger an immediate audit by the SEC. That was the second I knew. The sandcastle my father built for his golden boy was finally eroding under the tide of reality. Within hours, they would be at my door. They would use the word family like a weapon. They would ask me to move mountains, to lie to auditors, to sacrifice my own professional license to save Brian's skin one more time. But as I stared at the flickering screen, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For 15 years, I had been the one to catch them every time they fell. This time, I was ready to step aside and watch the ground rush up to meet them. The drive from downtown Chicago to Naperville takes 30 minutes at midnight, but every mile felt like a march toward a firing squad. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway of my parents' estate, my hands were clamped so tightly onto the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. The house, a sprawling Victorian-style fortress, sat silhouetted against the winter sky, a monument to a legacy I was currently keeping from hemorrhaging to death. I didn't knock. I used my key, stepping into the foyer where the scent of expensive sandalwood and Harold's heavy cigars hit me like a physical wall. The air in the study was thick, suffocatingly warm, and vibrating with a tension that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The tableau was exactly as I'd anticipated. My brother Brian was slumped on the tufted Italian leather sofa, his head buried in his hands, radiating a carefully curated aura of broken man. My father, Harold, was pacing the Persian rug like a caged predator, his silk robe billowing behind him. "You're late," Harold barked, not looking at me. "I was busy trying to prevent the SEC from flag-marking our escrow accounts," I replied, my voice flat and devoid of the tremor I felt in my chest. "Where is it?" Harold stopped pacing and slammed a crumpled folder onto the mahogany desk. I walked over, my movements deliberate, and opened it. Inside were the wire transfer confirmations I had seen on my monitor hours earlier. $5 million. Flushed away into a development project in Southside Chicago that, according to the preliminary search I'd run on the way over, was a shell corporation with no physical assets and a revoked business license. "Brian, did you even conduct a title search?" I asked, looking at my brother. "Did you look at the zoning laws or the lien history of the property before you authorized a $5 million unsecured wire?" Brian didn't look up. He let out a muffled groan. "It was a sure thing, Rachel. The brokers promised a 30% ROI within 6 months. I was trying to diversify our portfolio so we weren't just a trucking company anymore." "You weren't diversifying," I countered, the bitterness rising in my throat. "You were gambling with the company's liquidity. This wasn't a business move. It was a vanity project." "Enough!" Harold roared, his face a deep shade of crimson. "The money is gone. We can't claw it back without exposing Brian's lack of due diligence to the board. And if the board sees this, they'll vote for a leadership restructuring. I won't have my son's reputation shredded because of one ambitious mistake." He turned to me then, his eyes narrowing. The invisible architect in me knew exactly what was coming. This was the moment the pillar was expected to bear a weight that wasn't hers. "You're going to fix this, Rachel," Harold said, his tone shifting from rage to a chilling, businesslike command. "You're the COO. You oversee the operational risk budget. You're going to reclassify this $5 million loss as unforeseen infrastructure overhead. and equipment depreciation within your division. Your department handles the largest volume. The auditors won't blink at a 5% variance if you sign off on it. I felt the air leave my lungs. You're asking me to commit financial fraud, Dad. You're asking me to perjure myself to the auditors to cover up Brian's incompetence. If I sign those reclassifications and the IRS or the SEC conducts a forensic audit, my career is over. I could lose my professional standing. I could go to jail. Nonsense. Harold waved his hand as if dismissing a minor annoyance. You're the numbers expert. Everyone knows you're the most meticulous person in this firm. Your signature is gold. If you say it was an operational expense, they'll believe you. Brian's credit needs to stay clean so he can step into the CEO role next year. He can't have a $5 million black hole on his record. The paradox was staggering. I was trusted enough to commit a felony for them, but not qualified enough to lead the company I was currently saving. Before I could speak, I felt a soft, manicured hand on mine. My mother, Adelaide, had appeared from the shadows of the doorway. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her expression a mask of maternal tragedy. "Rachel, honey," she whispered, her voice trembling with that practiced, gentle manipulation. "You've always been the strong one. You've always been our rock. You don't need the titles or the accolades. You already have the respect of everyone who matters. But Brian, he's fragile. He needs this chance. If you do this, you're not just saving a company. You're saving your brother's future. You're saving our family's honor." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see a mother. I saw a recruiter for a suicide mission. I was their human shield, a sacrificial lamb meant to take the blow so the golden boy could keep his shine. Rage, deep-seated resentment, burned like acid in my gut, but my reason, the cold, analytical machine that had survived 15 years of enduring this, regained control. If I refused now, they would remove me from the system before I could gather evidence. I needed to be the good girl one last time. "I'll need the original wire instructions and the unsigned title opinions," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I need to study the technicalities of the ledger before I can see where the numbers can fit." Harold's posture relaxed immediately. "I knew you'd understand. Family first, Rachel. Always." I gathered the documents, my heart a frozen stone in my chest. I drove home in a daze, but the moment I stepped into my apartment, the invisible architect went to work. I didn't go to bed. I spent the rest of the night at my high-speed scanner. One by one, I digitized the proof of their betrayal. Wire confirmation number 4922. The unsecured debt agreement. The emails from Harold instructing Brian to bypass the compliance department. I uploaded everything to a hidden, dual-encrypted cloud folder I'd named Project Insurance. I looked at the folder icon on my screen, the glow of the monitor illuminating the grim set of my mouth. They thought they were giving me a family mission, but they were handing me the noose I would eventually use to bind their greed and secure my own survival. The cold reality of Project Insurance was still sitting in my cloud drive when the world shifted on its axis. 1 week after I had scanned those fraudulent wire transfers, my grandfather, Harold Sr., passed away. He was 88, the founder of Vance Logistics, and the only person who truly understood that a company isn't built on flashy marketing, but on the relentless precision of its operations. I was the only one in that sterile hospital room when his heart finally stilled. My father and Brian were 400 miles away at a networking golf invitational in South Carolina, chasing a contract they would never close. As the monitors flatlined, I held my grandfather's hand, rough and calloused despite his wealth. He had pulled me close minutes before, his voice a gravelly whisper that still echoes in my mind. "Rachel, they only see the gold on the walls. They don't see the rust in the foundation. Don't let them burn what I sweated to build. Those were his final instructions. He didn't ask me to be a good daughter or a supportive sister. He asked me to be a guardian. The funeral was a performance of high society grief. My mother, Adelaide, wore a designer veil that cost more than a warehouse worker's annual salary. My father played the part of the grieving successor, his eyes already darting toward the horizon of his own expanded power. But the true theater began 3 days later, in a mahogany-paneled law office in downtown Chicago. The room smelled of ancient parchment and expensive floor wax, the kind of place where fortunes are decided in silence. Harold sat at the head of the conference table, his chest puffed out, already laying out a map of new ventures for the firm. Brian was leaning back, checking his watch, likely dreaming of the Miami penthouse he planned to buy with his increased dividends. They weren't there to honor a legacy. They were there to divide the spoils. "Let's expedite this," my father said to the executor, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "We have an expansion project that requires immediate capital allocation." The attorney, a man who had served my grandfather for 40 years, didn't look up. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read. He bypassed the minor bequests and the charitable trusts, moving straight to the heart of the estate, the controlling interest of Vance Logistics. "And to my granddaughter, Rachel Elizabeth Vance," the attorney's voice remained steady, "I leave the remainder of my estate, including, but not limited to, 51% of all voting shares in Vance Logistics and its subsidiary holdings." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs right before a structural collapse. Harold's face drained of color, then turned a terrifying shade of purple. He didn't just stand up. He lurched. "That is an absurdity. My father was not in his right mind. This is a clerical error, or worse, a blatant manipulation." He turned his glare toward me, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "What did you do, Rachel? What did you whisper in his ear while I was away?" Brian's arrogance vanished, replaced by a panicked twitch in his jaw. 51%? That's control. That's impossible. He promised me a seat at the head of the table. Adelaide was the first to move toward me. She didn't shout. She used that same toxic tenderness she had utilized during the dinner in Naperville. She reached for my hand, her eyes swimming with manufactured concern. "Rachel, darling, we all know how much you loved him. You were exhausted, grieving, and perhaps you didn't realize that he was confused. This is too much for a young woman to carry. It's a burden he never should have placed on you. Surely you see that we need to rectify this for the sake of the family's stability." A month ago, that soft manipulation might have made me waver. But I was no longer the girl who sought their approval. I was the architect who had seen the rust they tried to hide. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a notarized document, a comprehensive mental competency evaluation performed by a top-tier geriatric psychiatrist just 30 days before my grandfather's passing. "Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "He knew the company was being bled dry by incompetence and ego. He didn't leave me a gift, Mother. He left me a command." I turned to the attorney, ignoring my father's trembling rage. "As the majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to a 30-day mourning period. During this time, all major capital expenditures and structural changes are suspended. No wires, no new contracts, and no reclassifications of operational budgets." The look on Harold's face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He had spent my entire life telling me I was a tool, and he had just realized the tool now owned the workshop. 30 days? Harold hissed. "We have creditors, Rachel. We have obligations." Then you should have thought about those obligations before you authorized a $5 million unsecured wire to a shell company, I replied. The room went cold. Harold knew exactly what I was referencing. The $5 million fraud from Project Insurance was the ghost at the table, and I was the only one who could see it. I stood up, gathering my things with a calculated, deliberate pace. I didn't need their permission to leave. I didn't need their seat at the table. I owned the table. As I walked out of the office and onto the streets of Chicago, the wind off the river felt sharp and clean. I stood by the railing, watching the dark water churn below. Behind me, in that oak-walled room, my family was likely screaming, plotting, and scrambling to find a way to break the will. They thought this 30-day window was a reprieve, a time for me to cool off or reconsider my loyalty. They were wrong. Those 30 days were for me to bring in the forensic auditors and the federal investigators. They thought they were losing their inheritance. They didn't realize they were losing their immunity. The silence of the following 10 days was heavier than the funeral itself. I had retreated to a hotel in downtown Chicago, surrounding myself with legal pads and encrypted files, waiting for the inevitable shift in tactics. My father had spent 30 years relying on my labor, and I knew he couldn't survive a single month without trying to reclaim his grip on the steering wheel. The crack in the silence came on a drizzly Tuesday evening in March. It wasn't a process server or a formal summons. It was a text from my mother, Adelaide, glowing on my phone screen like a plea for mercy. I made the beef bourguignon, Rachel. The way your grandfather loved it. The way you used to love it. We are hurting, and this distance is tearing me apart. Please, let's just be a family tonight. No lawyers, no business, just us. The invitation was a classic piece of Vance theater, using a dead man's favorite meal as bait to lure the wayward daughter back into the den. I knew it was a trap, but a part of me, the part that still remembered the little girl who just wanted a seat at the table, needed to see their faces one more time before the legal hammers started falling. Driving back to Naperville felt like regressing through time. The rain blurred the sprawling estates of our neighbors, mansions built on old money and polished secrets. When I stepped into the foyer, the atmosphere had undergone a jarring transformation. The screaming rage of the lawyer's office was gone, replaced by the warm, amber glow of the chandelier and the rich, savory scent of wine and slow-cooked meat. My mother met me at the door with a watery smile and a hug that felt a second too long. My father, Harold, stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. He didn't bark orders. He simply nodded, his face a mask of weary paternal endurance. "Welcome home, Rachel," he said softly. Dinner was an exercise in agonizing nostalgia. Adelaide spent an hour weaving tales of my childhood, how I used to organize my toy trucks by weight and destination, how I was always the dependable one. It was a sugar-coated cage, designed to remind me that my identity was tied to this house and the roles they had assigned me. As the plates were cleared, Harold's tone shifted. The invisible architect in me felt the pivot before he even spoke. He leaned forward, the firelight casting long shadows across his face. "Rachel, I've had time to reflect. I understand why your grandfather did what he did. He saw your brilliance. He saw that you are the engine of this company." He paused, a strategic beat of silence. "But he also left you in a den of wolves. The board of directors, the institutional investors in Chicago, they aren't family. They don't care about the Vance name. They will see a young woman with a majority stake, and they will tear you apart to get to the assets. You've managed operations, yes, but you've never faced a hostile takeover or a shareholder revolt." I watched him, my expression unreadable. This was the condescension I had lived with for 15 years. The idea that my competence was only valid within the walls he built. I want to protect you, he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. I've had our attorneys draw up a family unity agreement. You keep your shares. You keep the title of majority owner. But you grant me a 10-year irrevocable proxy for all voting rights. It allows me to handle the political filth of the board while you do what you do best. Run the warehouse. It keeps the family unified. It keeps you safe. He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. It wasn't a request. It was a demand wrapped in a silk ribbon of protection. My mother reached across the table, her hand covering mine. Sign it, honey. Let's go back to the way things were. You can focus on your work, maybe even find time to start a life of your own. Don't let this stress age you before your time. A feeling of resentment welled up in my throat like salt water. They still treated me like a child I couldn't trust with my entire fortune. They were trying to silence me with the law under the guise of a warm meal. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into my blazer and pulled out a small, sleek digital recorder. I set it on the table next to the agreement. No more stories about beef bourguignon, Dad, I said, my voice as cold as the rain outside. And no more fake protection. I didn't spend the last 10 days mourning. I spent them with a forensic accountant. Harold's eyes flickered, a momentary break in his composure. Let's talk about the employee pension fund, I continued. I found a $200,000 shortfall in the 401k matching accounts that occurred the same week Brian bought his custom Porsche 911. I found the unauthorized bridge loans you took out against our warehouse equipment to fund Brian's failed Southside project. That is a breach of fiduciary duty, Harold. It's an ERISA violation. It's federal. The warmth in the room vanished. The air curdled. Harold's hand tightened around his glass so hard I thought the crystal would shatter. I am the majority owner of Vance Logistics. I stood up, looking down at the man who had tried to diminish me for half a lifetime. From this moment forward, I am not your fixer. I am your superior. Every transaction over $10,000 requires my digital signature. Every contract Brian signs will be reviewed by my independent counsel. If you ever try to manipulate me with family again, that recording goes to the Department of Labor. You ungrateful... Harold slammed his hand on the table, the veneer finally cracking. The predator was back, his face contorted in a snarl. Adelaide let out a sharp, choked sob. Rachel, how can you be so cold-blooded? After everything we've given you? This is your father. This is the man who stole from his employees to coddle a son who can't read a balance sheet, I replied, gathering my bag. I looked at the family unity agreement and left it untouched. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one last time. The dinner was delicious, Mother. Truly. But the sweetness of the wine can't hide the rot in this house. Don't invite me back until you're ready to treat me as the owner of this company, and not as a daughter you can bully into silence. I stepped out into the night, the rain washing the scent of the mansion away. I was no longer the invisible pillar. I was the storm. The walk to my car after that disastrous dinner was the last time I felt the warmth of a shared history. By the following morning, the silence from my parents was no longer a sign of anger. It was a tactical blackout. I woke up to find myself removed from the family's group chat and blocked on every social platform by Brian. They weren't just cutting me out of their lives. They were preparing to erase my credibility. The isolation spread with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, my phone began to chime with messages that felt like tiny, poison-tipped arrows. Women I had known since childhood, friends of my mother from the various charitable boards in Naperville, sent well wishes that were actually insults. Rachel, dear, we heard you're going through a difficult psychological transition. Perhaps it's best if you step back and focus on your health. it became evident that Adelaide had launched her masterpiece, a whisper campaign. She was painting me as a woman who had suffered a mental collapse following my grandfather's passing. In the insular, status-obsessed circles of the Naperville Country Club, a nervous breakdown was a more believable narrative than a daughter finally standing up to a decade of exploitation. The apex of this social freezing occurred on Friday night. For 6 months, I had been the primary organizer for the Vance Foundation Gala, a high-profile event meant to celebrate our company's community impact. I arrived at the venue, my invitation in hand, only to be met at the entrance by 2 security guards I had personally hired. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance," the lead guard said, his eyes avoiding mine. "We have instructions from the board. For your own safety and the stability of the event, you are not permitted to enter. Your mother mentioned you weren't yourself." Standing under the large awning, excluded from the event I myself had orchestrated, anger threatened to overwhelm my reason. I stood on the sidewalk watching my family arrive, they appearing as a portrait of solemn grief. They didn't even glance at me. They were using my mother's reputation as a shield to hide the fact that they feared my truth. But while Adelaide was busy with social theater, Harold was drowning in the reality of his own debt. Brian's creditors weren't interested in my mental health. They wanted their $5 million. Harold knew the 30-day clock was ticking, and he was desperate. I knew my father's patterns. I knew that when a man like Harold Vance is cornered, he doesn't surrender. He escalates. This is why I had spent the previous week working with a cybersecurity firm to link my personal accounts to a real-time notification system. The alert hit my phone at 10:15 a.m. on Tuesday. Unauthorized access, fiduciary trust account number 8812. I was sitting in the quiet corner of a coffee shop near the Loop when the notification flashed. Someone was attempting to execute a wire transfer of $2 million using a general power of attorney. My breath hitched. I knew the legal landscape of Illinois. A power of attorney requires a notarized signature and, given the scale of my grandfather's estate, a verification of the principal's capacity. Harold hadn't just overstepped. He had committed a felony. He had forged my signature on a legal instrument and used the mental instability rumors Adelaide had spread to convince a longtime contact at our bank to bypass standard verification protocols. I had a choice. I could pick up the phone, call the fraud department, and freeze the transaction in 30 seconds. Harold would be reprimanded, the bank officer would be fired, and the status quo would remain. Or I could let the crime finalize. It was an agonizing intellectual paradox. Every instinct as a good daughter screamed to stop him before he crossed the point of no return. But the invisible architect knew that an attempted crime is a slap on the wrist, while a completed fiduciary theft of $2 million is a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. I sat there, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I watched the progress bar on my phone. Processing. Verification pending. Authorized. Complete. I felt a strange, icy calmness wash over me. The man who raised me had just stolen $2 million from his own daughter to save his failing son. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was atomized. I drove to the bank's regional headquarters in silence. I parked across the street and waited. 15 minutes later, Harold walked out of the glass doors. He was adjusted his tie, a look of immense, arrogant relief on his face. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery, unaware that he had actually just walked into a trap of his own making. I pulled out my camera and captured a single, high-resolution image of him holding the leather portfolio, the one that undoubtedly contained the forged power of attorney. Once his car cleared the lot, I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer, Angela. "He did it, didn't he?" she asked, her voice tight with professional concern. "He did," I replied, my voice sounding detached, as if I were narrating someone else's life. 2 million. Forged POA. He used the bank's branch manager, Miller, the one whose son Dad helped get into private school. Rachel, you know what this means. If we file this, there is no going back. This isn't a family dispute anymore. This is a criminal indictment. I looked at the photo of my father on my screen. I thought about the gala, the smear campaign, and the 15 years I had spent holding up the ceiling while they chipped away at the floor. They thought that $2 million was the price of Brian's freedom, I said, my gaze fixed on the fading taillights of Harold's car. They don't realize that every dollar they just stole is a day of prison I'm going to personally hand them for their betrayal. Draft the complaint, Angela. Include the social defamation as evidence of the conspiracy to commit fraud. I'm done being the shield. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my car. The war had officially moved beyond the walls of the Naperville mansion. For the first time, the weight I was carrying didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon. The morning sun of that final Friday didn't bring warmth. It brought a clarity that only comes when you've stopped hoping for a miracle and started calculating the cost of a victory. My phone vibrated against the nightstand at exactly 8 a.m. It was a text from Harold, as sparse and cold as a winter grave. Family meeting. 5 p.m. tonight at the house. Don't be late. It's time to end this madness. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I spent the next 4 hours in Angela's office, a glass-walled sanctuary in the city where the only thing that mattered was the admissible truth. We sat in a silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the high-speed printer and the scratching of a fountain pen. Before me sat the black leather folder, the physical manifestation of my 15-year tenure as the invisible architect. Inside were the instruments of my family's undoing, the original copy of my grandfather's will, the forensic report proving the power of attorney used to drain $2 million was a forgery, the detailed ledger of the ERISA violations regarding the employee pension funds, and a civil complaint for fiduciary fraud that Angela had already stamped for filing. I chose my attire with the precision of a general. A navy blue tailored suit, sharp enough to cut, and my hair pulled back into a tight, uncompromising knot. I looked at Angela as I snapped the folder shut. If I'm not back in my car by 6 p.m. with a safe text sent to your phone, proceed with the police, I said. My voice was a steady, low frequency. I wasn't the daughter they had spent a decade diminishing. I was the majority owner of their empire, and I was coming to collect. The drive to Naperville was a blur of gray slush and leafless trees. I pulled into the driveway at exactly 4:59 p.m. The mansion was eerily quiet. There was no sign of my mother's frantic social energy, no sound of Brian's obnoxious music. It was a house waiting for a sentence to be carried out. I walked through the foyer, my heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. I didn't head for the dining room. I walked straight into my father's study, the inner sanctum where every plan to exploit my labor had been hatched. The scene was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. Harold was seated in his high-backed wingback chair, positioned like a judge at a tribunal. Standing by the fireplace, their arms crossed in a synchronized display of aggression, were two men I didn't recognize. They wore charcoal suits that cost more than their ethics, their faces etched with a professional, calculated coldness. These weren't just lawyers, they were pressure brokers, men hired to break the will of difficult heirs through the sheer weight of their presence. Harold didn't offer a greeting. He simply gestured toward a single, low-profile wooden chair placed squarely in the center of the room, facing the three of them. An interrogation seat. "Sit down, Rachel," Harold commanded. His voice regained some of its old, abrasive edge. "The gentlemen here are Vincent and Marcus. They specialize in estate stabilization and family governance. They are here to ensure you finally fulfill your obligation to this name. I felt the atmospheric pressure of the room designed to make me feel small, but for the first time it didn't work. The suited men didn't move. Vincent, the taller of the two, let out a slow, deliberate exhale. "Ms. Vance?" he began, his tone a patronizing drone. "We've reviewed your grandfather's will and your recent obstructions. Your refusal to sign the Unity Agreement is causing irreparable harm to the corporate credit rating. We have documents prepared to place the estate into a temporary receivership based on your demonstrated inability to act in the best interest of the firm." He opened a briefcase on the mantel, revealing a thick stack of legalities meant to overwhelm me. Marcus stepped forward, his shadow falling across the floor. "Sign the waiver of control, Rachel. Do it now, and we can bury the audit into the operational variances you've been managing. If you don't, we'll move for a competency hearing. Your mother's testimony regarding your recent mental state will be quite compelling in court." The air was heavy with the stench of their desperation. They thought a few suits and a manufactured threat of a crazy label would make me crumble. They were still using the old blueprint, unaware that I had redesigned the entire building. I didn't sit in the interrogation chair. Instead, I walked past Marcus, straight to the mahogany coffee table that sat between us. Every variable of their plan was visible to me now. The forged POA, the social isolation, the hired muscle. It was all a hollow facade. I set my black leather folder down on the table. The sound of the heavy hide hitting the wood was a sharp, final crack that echoed through the silent room. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a very long, painful sentence. I didn't look at Harold. I looked directly at Vincent and Marcus, my arms folding over my chest in a mirror of their own aggression. "I've listened to your script about obligations and receivership," I said, my voice cutting through their posturing with a terrifying clinical calm. "But we're done playing the family meeting game. We've reached the end of the 30-day mourning period, and I have spent every hour of it documenting the rot in this foundation." I tapped the top of the folder. "So, gentlemen, you can stop talking about my obligations. I think it's time we started talking about your crimes." The smug satisfaction on Harold's face flickered. Marcus took a half step back, the confidence in his posture beginning to bleed out. They had expected a cornered girl. They hadn't realized I was the one who had locked the door from the inside. The folder sat between us on the mahogany table like a boundary line between two different worlds. As Harold reached out, his fingers trembling with a mix of entitlement and panic, I placed my hand firmly on the leather cover. I didn't push it toward him. I opened it to the first page, a certified forensic report from a handwriting expert, and a statement from the bank's compliance department. "Don't bother with the theatrics, Harold," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the study. "Before you utter another word about family unity or my mental state, you should know that this document confirms the power of attorney you presented at the bank was a blatant forgery. My fingerprints are nowhere near that instrument. Yours, however, are all over the original at the branch." I shifted my gaze to Vincent and Marcus. The aggressive posture they had maintained by the fireplace evaporated. I saw the subtle shift in their eyes, the moment a predator realizes they've walked into a larger trap. "And as for you two," I continued, sliding a secondary sheet across the wood. "I ran a background check through my independent counsel. You aren't estate stabilizers. You represent a predatory lending firm in Chicago that specializes in high-interest bridge loans for failing real estate developers. You aren't here to save the Vance name. You're here to collect the $5 million Brian lost. And you thought I was the easy mark who would sign over the collateral." The air in the room became frigid. Harold's face didn't just turn pale. It looked as though his entire worldview was dissolving. He looked at the fixers he had brought into his home, then back at me. The office door creaked open, and my mother, Adelaide, walked in. She looked at the messy pile of papers and the fading confidence in her husband. I turned to look at her, and for the first time, the decades of suppressed pain no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a verdict. "Mother," I said, using traditional language one last time, "you told the whole community that I was heartless and unstable because I refused to hand over the fruits of my life's labor. And yet, here you are, sitting in this room, watching Harold forge my signature. You let him commit crimes to save a son who stole his own employees' pensions just to buy a fancy car and apartment. You didn't want a family. You only wanted a servant who would never complain about the shackles." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Vincent snapping his briefcase shut. He didn't look at Harold. He didn't look at the unity agreement. He and Marcus walked toward the door without a word, their professional veneer completely shattered by the threat of a criminal conspiracy charge. They were gone before Harold could even find his voice. "Rachel, you can't do this." Harold finally managed, his voice a pathetic, rasping whisper. "If you file those documents, you're destroying everything. You'll be the woman who sent her father to prison. You'll never be able to show your face in this city again. No one will ever love a woman who betrays her own blood." I stood up, adjusting my blazer. I felt a strange, profound sense of detachment. The man standing before me wasn't the powerful figure who had loomed over my childhood. He was just a desperate, small individual clinging to the wreckage of a lie. I looked at my phone. It was 5:45 p.m. I typed a single message to Angela. "Safe, in." The only betrayal here was the 15 years I spent believing that if I worked hard enough, you would eventually see me as a person, I said, my gaze steady. "This meeting wasn't a negotiation, Harold. It was a courtesy. I'm not here to ask for my inheritance. I'm here to take possession of what is legally mine." I gathered my original files, leaving the copies on the table like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a prison cell. I walked toward the door, passing my mother, who was now weeping silently into her silk handkerchief. I didn't stop to comfort her. The time for comfort had expired years ago in a warehouse office while I was doing Brian's homework and Harold's taxes. At the threshold, I stopped and looked back at the room that had been my prison for so long. Harold was slumped in his chair, staring at the forged POA as if he could make the crime disappear by sheer force of will. "Don't bother calling your lawyers tonight," I said, the finality of the moment settling over me like a blanket. "They've already been served with the notice of my intent to file a civil suit for fiduciary fraud and the criminal referral for identity theft. I told you before. I said to wait for you in court." I stepped out into the crisp March air. The driveway was illuminated by the flashing lights of a patrol car and Angela's SUV. I didn't look back when I heard the sound of a vase shattering against the wall inside the mansion. The final, futile tantrum of a fallen king. It has been exactly 12 months since I walked out of that family meeting, and the world looks entirely different from the top floor of Vance Logistics. After a grueling legal battle and a full forensic audit, the board had no choice but to recognize my majority stake and appoint me as CEO. I spent the first 6 months purging the rot my grandfather warned me about. We transitioned to sustainable logistics and eco-friendly freight, and for the first time in a decade, our profit margins are transparent and healthy. Harold avoided a lengthy prison sentence by transferring all of his remaining personal assets to pay off the $5 million debt Brian had borrowed from his pension fund. Now he lives in a modest apartment in a different area, his reputation in Naperville completely gone. Adelaide remains by his side, occasionally sending me forgiveness emails that I never open. Brian? He's working in a regional warehouse in Indiana. No Porsche, no penthouses. He's learning what it actually takes to move a pallet from point A to point B, the hard way. People ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if the wealth was worth the loss of my family. I tell them the same thing. You can't lose something you never truly had. I didn't trade my family for a company. I traded a lie for my own life. They used to say my intelligence was meant to serve them. I proved that my intelligence was meant to liberate me. Never underestimate a woman who has spent 15 years learning the secrets of the foundation while everyone else was busy admiring the gold on the walls.